Hello. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's really an honor to be here. Very exciting for me to be presenting at such a wonderful center and to have all of your attention. So thank you so much. The title is Psychedelics, the New Behaviorism. I'm going to talk a little bit about some new approaches, what we call third wave behavioral psychotherapies, and how I see those potentially integrating with psychedelic psychotherapy. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about some of the work from our group looking at psychedelics and antisocial and criminal behavior, and what we've learned from those that give us reason to think that these third wave behavioral therapies, sometimes called mindfulness-based behavioral therapies, have great potential synergistically to work with the psychedelic experience, with integration, and with accentuating the positive effects of the psychedelic experience. So when I start off, I want to talk about my background. Originally, as a graduate, I worked in jails in Chicago, and my initial work was really in forensic psychology and in preventing recidivism. And later, as I started my own academic career, I became involved in cannabis and psychedelic research. And early on, I was able to integrate those a little bit. So I want to go back a bit in history and talk about some of the first wave of psychedelic research and what that tells us about this aspect of antisociality. And when I go back some of the original. Some of those that came before us in the psychedelic research. I also want to acknowledge, of course, that when I go back to the 1960s and some of the research from even, I guess, a little bit earlier than that, that's not really where it started. When we talk about psilocybin in particular and ayahuasca and other psychedelic medicines, these are indigenous medicines, and these technologies were developed from perhaps time immemorial. I don't think we have a good date to stamp them of where they started, but we can be quite certain that for a large part they started with the indigenous people of the Americas, of South America. And I also have to note that coming from the University of British Columbia, we call it the University of British Columbia, although it had a really limited time of being under British rule. It was a good time, don't get me wrong. But the university where I come from is on the unceded territory of the Okanagan First Nations. So I also want to acknowledge that as well. So when you think about this first wave of psychedelic psychotherapy, perhaps the most well-known study would be Timothy Leary's Concord prison experiment. And in that study, Dr. Leary took psilocybin inside the institution, incarcerated, with incarcerated men, psilocybin. Early on, he reported some pretty remarkable outcomes from that. Down the road, in a re-examination of it by Rick Doblin, the leader of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. I'm part of MAPS Canada. He's from MAPS US. We're an offshoot. So Rick Doblin followed up and found out that he had maybe not done as careful a statistical analysis as he might have, and that the outcome was not great. And he noted that perhaps the reason that there weren't long-term benefits, despite the initial appearance of some pretty profound changes in men who were quite difficult to treat, was the lack of post-release support. So after talking a little bit about some of this first round of psychedelic research and some of what we're coming out with, I want to maybe point us a little bit towards what kind of therapeutic modalities might be most helpful. And an interesting thing that Leary pointed out was that with recidivism, we really had a very solid empirical measure of therapeutic change. So it wasn't just people saying that they felt better, it was really the fact that they weren't getting in the kind of trouble that they had got in before. And so those are generally positive. I also, I have some colleagues from the UK and tend to have a real positive, in general, I hope I'm not implying anything, but a positive look at Canada. I think that's great. I like it too. But we also have a little known history of using psychedelics with correctional samples. A very terrible one, in fact, LSD in a coercive milieu therapy program. So I think as we move forward with so much enthusiasm, certainly I share the enthusiasm, I've devoted a good chunk of my life to this work, we also have to be careful not to repeat some of the mistakes of the past. And in this case, well-intentioned, I have to assume well-intentioned clinicians were taking LSD in a coercive milieu therapy program. And there's a class action suit that's still ongoing, despite that these were happening in the 70s. You don't hear much about this when you hear about the golden age of psychedelic research. But they put people in nude encounter groups, violent men in naked encounter groups, and gave them huge doses of LSD and scopolamine dissociatives. And needless to say, the effects were not universally positive. But it's also worth looking at some of the reports at the time. So in 1975, it all ended at Oak Ridge. This is in Ontario in Canada, with a mass psychedelic trip that went quite wrong, and finally the authorities came in and shut it down. And of course, that's what we're all scared of in this new psychedelic renaissance. That even though it seems like it's really growing, we don't want to give cause for people who are less positively disposed to this work to shut us down. But even at the time, if we look at the reports from the news, they're disturbingly similar. Instead of seeing floridly disturbed and abused inmates, there are young, handsome, intelligent men discussing their violent actions with insight and understanding. Miraculous, right? The most promising, this is from 77, the most promising known for assisting offenders in self-reformation. So perhaps a note of caution before I get into more cheerful subject matter. So that's from the first wave. And now I want to move into the second wave. And really, from my perspective, it starts in about 2014 when this paper came out from my colleague Peter Hendricks, looking at recidivism again. And in this case, a large group of people under probation. I don't know, you guys have called probation here, where you're released from custody, but okay. Yeah, so a very large sample, and they looked at hallucinogen use disorder in this study. And really, it's a DSM disorder. You guys don't have the DSM here, but it's similar diagnostic categories. And really, it was just a marker for frequent hallucinogen use. It's not really conceptualized as a disorder per se for our purposes here. So frequent hallucinogen use is 1%, so still about 250 men. And what they found was, when you look at these odds ratios, I don't want to get too much into the statistics, but if you look at the underlying 0.6, that means that those who had this disorder were 60% as likely to recidivate as those without the disorder. What kind of disorder is going to cut recidivism by about 40%? It's really remarkable. If you look at some of the factors that we tend to think of as being protective for recidivism, things like having a job is not as good as having a hallucinogen use disorder. I guess it depends on your job. And being married, really a sign of stability and support, 0.87. So neither of those are as strong as having hallucinogen use disorder. So that's pretty profound. We really wanted to follow that up. So in a study from our group, looking at hallucinogen use and intimate partner violence. So the most frequent form of violence is intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence. We tested it, and this is in the Chicago jail sample, and we found similar protective effects. And it even got some coverage over here. We're a little less restrained in Canada, tripping out instead of flipping out. That's how they called it. But our results were remarkably similar to what the initial Hendricks study found. They found that it was about a 60% reduction. So we had 300 male inmates from Illinois County Jail, all of whom had substance use disorders. And in this case, we had a little bit more detailed information on them. So we were able to look at any hallucinogen use and also hallucinogen use disorder, as Hendricks and his group had done. And 44% of our sample had used hallucinogens at some time, and 7% met criteria for the disorder, so frequent hallucinogen use. And what we found, and these are survival curves, we found that amongst those who had not used any hallucinogens, about only 58% of them didn't commit a crime, so they survived, not being rearrested for domestic violence, whereas amongst the hallucinogen users, it's closer to 75%. So replicating those findings in an entirely different sample. Much so, the hallucinogen users in this case were much less likely to recidivate to partner violence. And remember, this is ad lib hallucinogen use. This isn't with the assistance of any kind of psychotherapy. And when we look at hallucinogen use disorder, so a marker for more intense hallucinogen use, we found that a little over 10% of those with a hallucinogen use disorder recidivated, compared to about 35% of those without the disorder. So really pretty remarkable. When we look at the recidivism literature, there isn't much out there, many interventions that are going to give us this kind of rate. I mean, I'll even go as far as to say that I don't know of any interventions that give us this kind of protective effect. So we wanted to follow this up, and these are my colleagues on this study, Michelle Thiessen, my graduate student, and Brian Bird and Adela France from Ontario. And in this case, we looked at it with young adults. And we also wanted to look at domestic violence, partner violence, as we call it. And we looked at LSD use, because psilocybin use is pretty widespread where I'm from in Canada. So it really wasn't a marker for much. A lot of the time people will just take some shrooms when they're drinking or smoking weed or whatever, whereas LSD was a little bit rarer, so more indicative of a true psychedelic experience. I want to say, so this was taken from a couple different samples of university students, as well as Amazon Mechanical Turk and Reddit, so we had a diverse sample. And I have to say a little bit about UBC, where I'm from, perhaps interesting side note around psilocybin. So, as many of you know, psilocybin, called the magic mushroom in the 50s, the famous Life magazine article where it was rediscovered in Mexico with Maria Sabina, the indigenous curandero, who agreed to provide psilocybin to Gordon Wasson in his search for it, the magic mushroom. And we have anthropology is one of our specialties at UBC, and there was anthropology students who quickly followed. Many people went down to Mexico to work with Maria Sabina, and a group from UBC came. A group of students, and they took the mushrooms, and they came back to UBC campus. And there are psilocybin mushrooms that grow wild all over the UBC campus. They used to more. Now a lot of them have been plucked. But back then they were all over the place. They said, gee, these look like the mushrooms that we took down in Mexico. Let's give them a try. They're brave. I mean, I don't recommend that anyone here just try mushrooms because they look like something that maybe is appealing. And yes, lo and behold, they were psilocybin mushrooms, and that's the first validated, recorded incidents of people using psilocybin mushrooms outside of their ancestral home in Mexico. It was on the UBC campus. Yes. So a little bit of mushroom trivia there. I know there might be some people here who like psilocybin. So anyways, to go back to the study, in this case we looked at a sample of non-incarcerated individuals. We looked at LSD use. And the proportion of IPV perpetration, intimate partner violence perpetration, much lower, as we'd expect in this group, than in the incarcerated sample. But the LSD users were still lower. So we have it once again in yet another sample. We see less violence amongst psychedelic users. In this case, it was only 8% of the psychedelic users compared to 12% of those who weren't using LSD. And in this case, because we were working with survey data, we were able to query a little more deeply what some of the mechanisms might be. And one of the big mechanisms that we proposed, based perhaps on our theoretical orientation, was that it would be emotion regulation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we come up. Emotion regulation, a construct that is quite tied to mindfulness. So, emotion regulation is the ability to recognize your emotions and decide whether or not you're going to respond to them. Sort of a cognitive diffusion is also related to emotional regulation. So the ability to see your emotional reactions and then decide not to be entirely fused with them as if they're commands. Some of the questions on the emotion regulation questionnaire, I'm confused about how I feel. That would show lower emotion regulation. When I'm upset, I acknowledge my emotions. That would be positively correlated with emotion regulation. What we found was, yes, indeed, LSD use was related to better emotion regulation, which was in turn related to less intimate partner violence. So the relationship, the apparent protective effects of LSD use were largely mediated by better emotional regulation. We thought that was pretty exciting. Also, since it's the same study, we're looking at different psychedelics, we found, we measured partner violence with different types of partner violence. We were looking at physical abuse, but there's also emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and there's some positive stuff as well in that scale. And just to share with you a little side note about MDMA, is that couples who had both taken MDMA were more likely to negotiate their relationship troubles rather than resort to violent behavior. So some of the items on negotiation, suggesting a compromise, showing caring despite disagreement. So this idea that emotion regulation and the associated construct of mindfulness might underlie some of the beneficial effects of psychedelics is showing up other places as well. I was very excited to see this just from 2019. Ayahuasca use improves emotion regulation. So this is brand new in a community sample of individuals with borderline-like traits. So traits associated with borderline personality. And borderline personality is quite a pronounced risk factor for intimate partner violence. So the idea that we can see improved emotion regulation with psychedelic use is quite concordant with our findings. Prior studies from the same group found that taking ayahuasca led to enhanced mindfulness. And the group from Hopkins have also found that combining psilocybin with meditation really was synergistic in enhancing the effects of the psychedelic experience. So taken together, what I propose is that this evidence suggests that psychedelics may enhance mindfulness and emotion regulation, and that perhaps, conversely, practicing mindfulness and engaging in activities like mindfulness that facilitate emotion regulation might have sort of a bidirectional synergistic effect. I have to note again some contrary findings. So this is back again from that Oak Ridge study, the LSD in the coercive milieu environment. The naked marathon LSD and dissociative sessions. And in those cases, they found that the psychedelic therapy actually made people worse. But when we think about the whole context of it, it's not entirely surprising that it would make people worse. So this is for sexual crimes. However, another piece of this, particularly it made them worse particularly if they were high in psychopathic personality, antisocial traits. And I think an important piece I'd like to just introduce briefly is that there are different types of violence. So we want to be specific about what types of violence psychedelic use may be protected for. We have this antisocial, high psychopathic violence. People are generally violent. They use violence as a mean of control and domination. They lack remorse, sometimes called intimate terrorists. And that's the minority of partner violence. Most partner violence comes from people who are emotionally dysregulated. Fear of abandonment, and the violence is largely reactive. So it's impulsive violence, often in the face of potential abandonment. So it could be that it's this impulsive, dysregulated subtype of violent individuals for whom psychedelics may be most effective. I also want to introduce the possibility that when we think about violence, we go beyond violence directed towards others to violence directed towards the self. And some work from our group suggests these are very related constructs, self and other directed violence. When I say self-directed violence, I mean suicidality, self-injury. And interestingly, we found protective effects for psychedelics when it comes to self-directed violence as well. This is coming from the Hendricks group. We see that lifetime psychedelic use is related to reduced odds of suicidal ideation, suicidal preparation, and suicidal attempts. So we see general violence, we see partner violence, and we see self-violence all seem to be reduced by psychedelic use. And a recent study coming from UBC, from some of my colleagues there, also showed that lifetime psychedelic use, and this is amongst a highly marginalized group of largely sex workers on the street in Vancouver, where we have high rates of self-harm and suicidality. Lifetime psychedelic use hugely reduced. They're 40% as likely as those who hadn't used psychedelics to engage in suicidality. So taken together, we see that psychedelic use seems to protect against violence towards yourself, violence towards others, violence towards intimates. And how do we understand that? So when we look, how does it work? Is it emotion regulation? Is it mindfulness? I think we don't really know, but it seems like that's really the question, is how do we support this? How do we facilitate those positive effects? So the preliminary evidence from psychedelics and violence was mixed. Methodological problems, questionable therapeutic practices, to say the least. The end note was we need more post-release support from that first group, now from the first wave. Now in the second wave, the psychedelic renaissance, we see potentially a real place for psychedelics in reducing violence, but the question is what type of support is optimal. And there's this great recent paper out in International Review of Psychiatry, just came out last year, that does a nice overview of potential styles of intervention to facilitate psychedelic therapy. There's this classic psychoanalytic, psycholytic approach, talk therapy with low doses, give you access to your unconscious, ego loosening, etc. Perhaps even regression to earlier developmental stages. I'm not quite sure what that means, but they claim that that's part of it. There's the humanist existential approach, which seems to be the dominant model in psychedelic psychotherapy today. High dose of psychedelics, you're not talking to people during the session, you're letting the inner healer come out, right? Which is very humanistic, the idea that if you take the blockages away, people's essential direction and motivation towards psychological well-being will take over. What we're looking at our group in BC is combining psychedelic use with motivational enhancement, which is really an outgrowth of humanistic psychotherapy. There's also been some work from the Hawkins group with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And what I want to finish my talk by proposing is there a role for plain old behaviorism? And it may seem like an unlikely partner, the dryness of behaviorism. You don't think of B.F. Skinner as someone you want to trip out with necessarily. But I think that Skinner wouldn't agree with that. This quote from Skinner, of course, the father of behaviorism, to Abraham Maslow, the early existentialist, saying, I've had peak experiences too. Just because I work with pigeons doesn't mean I can't have peak experiences. And I think the type of behaviorism that has the most potential for this might be these third wave of behavior therapy. So when we look at behavior therapy, there's that initial behavior therapy, stimulus response, positive negative reinforcement. And really that's not so much in vogue anymore. It hasn't been for a while. It's largely been replaced by cognitive therapy, CBT. And I think that here in the UK, you guys are well ahead of us in implementing cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis to a lesser degree. But the new, what's sometimes called the third wave of behavior therapy, are acceptance and mindfulness-based approaches. Some of the most prominent is probably dialectical behavior therapy. Are people familiar with that here? It's gaining a lot of momentum in Canada and the US, and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, also mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, another one for depression. And really they focus on cognitive processes rather than content. So whereas earlier forms of cognitive behavioral therapy focused on changing your thoughts, challenging your thoughts, the third wave focuses on just looking at the process and observing thoughts as thoughts. And that's really where the mindfulness piece comes in. So I can't, in the time here, I don't want to give you more than just a pointer as something to, look into if you're interested, and propose that DBT has some real promise for psychedelic integration and preparation. DBT is really a blend of three theoretical positions, and this is taken right from Marsha Linehan, who's the founder of DBT. It's a behavioral science. She would describe herself as a radical behaviorist, but also someone who has a deep Zen practice. So there's the acceptance piece, which is essential. There's change and there's acceptance. So the change comes from the behavioral sciences, and the acceptance comes from her contemplative practice. And those are balanced within a dialectical framework. And if you were to look at someone doing DBT, it doesn't look radically different. The underpinnings are different, but the actual practice, if you were to spy on someone in session, it wouldn't look all that different. So when we look at the goals of DBT, and there's the book if you want to read it, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Borderline Personality Disorder. Interestingly, these were developed primarily to treat people with persistent suicidal behavior. And as I showed earlier, that's something that psychedelics have been shown to have some potential effectiveness for reducing. Core mindfulness is a big part of it. So that's really the underpinning of the entire process. Is the mindfulness, not unlike what we started off with today. And also emotional regulation is another piece. And as I've demonstrated, I think emotional regulation has a potential mechanism for the effectiveness of psychedelics. So DBT has a lot of stages. Initially it was developed for people with severe suicidal behavior, people who often carried the label of borderline personality disorder. It's such a stigmatized label, at least in North America, that I'm reluctant to use it. I say people who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. But there are people who struggle attaining even basic capacities. So the first stage of DBT is working to attain basic capacities. Stop engaging in life-threatening behaviors. You can't show up to therapy if you're dead. Therapy-interfering behaviors. Again, if you're suicidal, you can't engage in therapy. Quality of life interfering behaviors is the next stage. But once you get past that, there's working on post-traumatic stress reduction. So many people who meet criteria for borderline personality have a very traumatic upbringing or have had other traumas throughout their life. Once you get past that stage, though, there's resolving problems in living and increasing respect for self. And for so many of us who are interested in psychedelic therapy, it's not only for those who have severe problems in day-to-day life, but for people who just want to enhance their well-being or maybe struggle with regular levels of distress. And even attaining the capacity for freedom and sustained contentment, which is something I think many of us can work on. So this is not something that has to be restricted to people with severe psychopathology. Acceptance and commitment therapy is another modality that I think is really promising. It's the main target is enhancing psychological flexibility, decentering, becoming defused from your thoughts so you don't feel entirely tied or combined with them. Distancing and perspective shifting are all things that are worked on, and ACT and DBT are very similar, and they work together quite a bit. A lot of people who work on third-wave behavior therapies will borrow from both approaches. So cognitive diffusion, again, acceptance, contact with the present moment, learning to see the observing self, and that's something that we see coming up in psychedelic therapy, sometimes particularly with ketamine therapies, which is an interesting aspect of that medicine. And so the goal of ACT is to get away from psychological inflexibility. Again, as I think I covered a lot of this experiential avoidance, being fused with your thoughts, and coming together in psychological flexibility. And perhaps that is really the mechanism by which psychedelics may have their effect, by enhancing psychological flexibility, contact with the present moment, acceptance, diffusion, committed action, values. And of course, this isn't new. I always like to mention Alan Watts, sometimes an overlooked pioneer of the psychedelic therapy, and he highlighted these as mechanisms of psychedelic action. Concentration on the presence, awareness of polarity. And the idea that combining psychedelics with contemplative practices is not at all new either. Of course, it's been there since the beginning of at least the 60s psychedelic work. Ram Dass would be here now, I'm sure familiar to some of you. And one of Leary's early books, so we're returning to Timothy Leary here. One of his first books on the psychedelic experience was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead and some of those contemplative practices as well. So we've outlined some of this work in an article in that same issue of the International Review of Psychiatry. And just to summarize, the idea that the distinctive feature of these third-wave behavioral therapies is the integration of spiritual and contemplative practices. Linehan herself has described DBT as a behavioral translation of Zen. ACT conceptualized suffering as emerging from attachment to internal experiences. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy foregrounds the development of a meditation practice. And so I think this also allows us an avenue of potential convergence with some of the modern traditions of psychedelic-assisted therapy. So it gives us a contemporary way of integrating some of this work that comes from the first wave of psychedelic research. So just the take-home is that, you know, accentuated mindfulness and emotion regulation, based on some of our empirical work, might underlie some of the effects of psychedelic experience. We have these well-organized techniques for developing mindfulness and emotion regulation through these therapies. And so the question really is, do adjunctive third-wave therapies have potential to enhance the effectiveness of psychedelic therapy? And the truth is we really don't know. When we look at all those different approaches to psychedelic therapy, and it's got to be, you know, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but we haven't done the side-by-side trials to figure out which kind of therapy is best. So I'm certainly not saying this is the way. I'm suggesting it as something that we might consider as we look at how best to integrate psychotherapy with modern practices. And plug for our group, we're behind what you guys are doing here, but we have our own work going on at the BC Centre for Substance Use. We're getting ready to start our trial of psilocybin for addictions, for alcohol and stimulant misuse. And we're also a site for the MDMA psychotherapy trial for PTSD, phase 3 of the MAPS trial, as well as getting ready to perhaps start some observational work on ketamine. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. You can find me here. I'd love to hear from you, and that's a cannabis leaf because a lot of the work that I do is on cannabis as well. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Zach. We're going to have some time for questions now from the audience, and we'll have a couple of people going around with the microphone. I'm going to kick off, though, and that's to ask you a little bit, Zach, about the sort of interrelationship between what you talked about and the mystical experience. And you spoke about the core element of what may be going on with psychedelics being related to psychological flexibility. I found myself wondering about the relationship between, because the Johns Hopkins group have found that the degree of mystical experience seems to be associated with longer term benefits. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your opinion of the relationship between the meditative state, psychedelic state, and the mystical state.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating relationship. I think very hard to pin down when we talk about the mystical experience. And there was this great paper from the Imperial College group recently looking at meditation and mindfulness and the psychedelic experience. Yeah, so a great paper from the Imperial College group here looking at psychedelics and mindfulness. And I think one of the main things that they were looking at is drug-induced ego dissolution. And it could be that ego dissolution, that experience of the observing self, separated from the judging self, or the fused self, the self that's fused with emotions and fused even with personal narrative and identity. So I think that perhaps the mystical experience can provide a lived experience of that, as opposed to a faraway goal where you're going to be able to get away from the chattering self, or from that, which can often be unkind in the case of psychopathology. So all those negative cognitions and schemas that arise, to have a time that's free of that due to ego dissolution, if that's what we want to call it, or ego diminution, I think that might be it. So I think that the mystical experience, that loss of identity and sense of unity, gives one a perspective that doesn't have to be all about all these negative self-thoughts. It doesn't have to be about that narrative. It can be about a more expansive mental experience.
Okay. This chap, I think, was first.
Hi, John Anderson. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I was listening to you there talking about different approaches that are used for the integration of therapy. And I personally think that it's far too early to really come down on, what one being necessarily or possibly better than another, because as a trainee counsellor myself, I think the thing that's always struck me is that it's actually a therapeutic relationship, the bond that is formed between the client and the therapist. That is probably the more significant thing, probably more important than the actual method that you use. And if psychedelics are anything, I think it encourages us to work in a more integrated fashion, because the experiences that people have are often very diverse. And I know from my own personal experience, struggle for it to fit just within one modality. So I think if we maybe are able to recast therapy, if we're going to do that in a more kind of integrated framework that allows therapists much more leeway to mix and match between different methods as per the requirements of the client at the end of the day, because different people will need different things, be at different stages, have different levels of resistance. So for example, someone who's very high in resistance might benefit more from a humanistic approach at that point rather than maybe going into ACT or something like that. So I just wonder what your kind of view of that would be.
Well, I certainly agree with you that any kind of therapy is really contingent on a strong relationship, and particularly if someone's going to have that such a profound and powerful psychedelic experience, there has to be trust. And we know all about set and setting, and I don't think I said it. I meant to say it, is that none of the work that I've done with incarcerated populations involve people taking psychedelics while incarcerated. And that's not something that I would ever encourage. And showing that Oak Ridge experiment tells you where that can go. So I think there has to be absolute respect and engagement, and the therapeutic relationship is central. At the same time, so many people have benefited from the psychedelic experience in the absence of a therapist. So we have to wonder what's going on there. So I think creating the safe setting is paramount if we're going to lead people to these potentially scary and certainly unfamiliar places. So I agree with that, and I think we do have to be open to everything. If we look back to some of the work from the initial period, a lot of it was so psychodynamic. So it was all about taking enough psychedelics that you could follow the red thread back to your birth trauma. And I think we even see some of that with Groff's work, which I have immense respect for. I think what I'm saying is that it need not be that necessarily, but that's certainly something that can be powerful. And I think that engaging with past trauma may be a big mechanism for psychedelic psychotherapy. And in order to do that, you need to have that supportive relationship. So I'm not dismissing that trauma-based or narrative-based type of therapy, but I also think we should be open to perhaps less structured or less narrative approaches that are more focused on the here and now.
It's worth saying that in the trials that we're doing, we walk a bit of a tightrope with this because the regulators require that you tell them what the model is that you're doing. But in a sense, the model is that there isn't a model, and then we're encouraging a core sense of empathy and openness and flexibility. But nonetheless, you need to tell people who are regulating what you're doing. So there's always this sort of give and take, particularly when you're going through this sort of tightly regulated process, which we need to do in order to get the drug out of Schedule 1. So that's my 2 pence worth.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think it is good to be able to tell people what it is that you're doing, but we don't really know what is the best approach. Yeah.
And I think that reflects a sort of ineffable nature of it. It also reflects maybe the sort of core mystical experience and the ineffable nature of that. Camilla?
Thank you so much for your talk and for all your experience in this period and bring that to us today. I'm working with James on the psilocybin trial here, and I was just sparked by what you said about the idea that the psychological support needs to be integrative, and I totally agree with that, which made me think about, if everything, the randomized control trials here in psilocybin go according to plan, they do show a positive effect, that who are going to be the psychologists helping give this support? And because we've got this model of improving access to psychological therapies, where there's a lot of CBT being given out. And I'm actually doing CBT with an amazing supervisor who's actually taught by Beck. So that's amazing. But I'm not amazing at it, it's really hard. What I'm trying to say is the skill, the ability to use a sort of an integrated model of psychotherapy where you can use a humanistic approach sometimes, or DBT or ACT or compassion or mindfulness, or maybe even more psychoanalytical stuff. You need to have immense training and experience in that, and perhaps people should have a proper psychotherapy training in kind of more depth psychology, not just a sort of a simpler training. I just hope, well, I don't know, what do you think, James? Maybe it's a question for James. Do you think it's going to be possible for the NHS to pay actual psychotherapists? Do you see what I mean?
To pay them
to support.
Well, of course they have to.
No, I know, but but people who've had experiential psychotherapy training, I think that's what I'm saying. There's the other question about whether they need to, whether you should also have psychedelic experience.
There's no substitute for experience and wisdom and life experience. So I think, in that sense, good psychotherapy perhaps more likely to be delivered by people who've got lots of experience. So the idea that you could provide someone with a short-term training and then plug them in to be a psilocybin therapist, no, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think how we do it, and this brings into the scenario of how you scale this therapy if it were ever licensed. That is particularly difficult. And it's very much on my mind even now, and I know it is for the people who are funding our trial.
I guess that needs to be the underlying message of my empty threads.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I think, and Zach's already alluded to this, you can't control for the variation in therapists. You can't control for that. And were you to try, it would sort of defeat the object. I think you can control the environment, and probably the most meaningful research is therefore about what the optimal environment is, and then the acceptance of the degree of variability in therapeutic application, and probably being able, participants being able to change therapists if things are not going well. So find the right fit, and that reflects the flexibility.
Thank you so much. It's been really engaging. My name's Lily Davey. I work as a coach, and my mum was in Jungian analysis. I have used psychedelics. I'm very interested in the shamanic world as well as the world of psychiatric research and psychotherapy. It seems to me there are so many frames we could put on the subject, and I love that you mentioned Indigenous people and practices, because when we start to talk about the mystical experience, we can't control for that. So the context in which we're looking at this data is a very, very limited one, I guess. And I'm just interested for either of you talking to this space of this wider frame that we find ourselves in, both in terms of how we contextualize our findings and consider other knowledge systems in which they could be located, as well as the wider frame of the climate emergency and the need for whatever we're doing to become enacted and embodied in the practice of the here and now, not just within institutions, which could indeed our knowledge could end up in the hand of financiers and Trump, just talking now about trade deals in the NHS. So I'm sorry to make it such a big frame, but I can't help but look at things a bit systemically. Thank you.
Well, I think it's going to be essential to go back to some of the sources. The indigenous people of South America and to a lesser degree North America, and certainly the mescaline traditions of the southern United States, have a really developed technology. And unfortunately, a lot of it's been wiped out or been suppressed. But we have to engage with that history. We can't start at Gordon Wasson. We can't start with Timothy Leary, and we have to acknowledge that there's a much larger history and start to look at how these medicines were used in that context. And if you think about some of the traditions in Peru or even the American Indian Church or the peyote, it's something that families do together. It's something that people do in life transitions, and the whole concept of and I talk about we're going to engage spirituality. One of the things we work on when we're trying to integrate mindfulness into the practice, so we don't want to scare anyone off by making this seem like some religious thing. And I think of a cannabis lawyer, John Conroy, who I work with a bunch in BC, and he always says, if you're going to break the law, don't break two. Because he got tired of people speeding down the highway with 60 pounds of cannabis. So if you're going to break the law, break them one at a time. So I think there's almost a feeling like we're pushing the envelope. We don't want to push two envelopes. So integrating spirituality together, no, we're going to be really scientific. We're going to dose the psilocybin exactly by body weight. But if we do that, then we're really ignoring this more integrative, holistic approach. It's not an add-on. It's not window dressing. It's really where this all comes from, and it's the folks who know how to integrate this into their day-to-day life and who have been using it since time immemorial, and who, without engaging in ethnic gloss, were able to live, to talk to your climate crisis, we're able to live in Canada and for a long time without really screwing up the environment so badly. I mean, we've done a lot in the last couple hundred years. So yes, there's undoubtedly a piece of that I think we need to figure out how to work. And I think the way to figure out how to work it is to ask questions and try to avoid as much as it's possible coming at it from our frame and say, well, how do you use this? And I think humility is going to be key there. I don't have the answers for that.
Yeah, it sort of boils down to me, sort of how do we be kinder to each other? How do we be more humble? I think that there's a much wider socio-political narrative, maybe underpinning much broader cultural change, and I have no idea how that's going to work out. All I know is that in terms of the legal situation we find ourselves in with these drugs, that really it is slightly different now because of the change with cannabis, but prior to that, the only way you could get a drug out of that schedule was with a health-related argument, and to do that, you had to collect clinical trial data. So I see it, I do it because I want to try and develop new treatments to help people, but it's also part of a sort of broader, slightly more open attitude towards these sorts of things. But how that will turn out, how it might translate into a better understanding of our relationship with nature and our planet, and the fact that we are nature, I don't know, but I'm hopeful.
If I could just add one thing to that, I think we talk about integrating spiritual practices with psychedelics, but and is it health, is it spirituality? But do we need to compartmentalize these things? And is that something that the bearers of this wisdom from the past, or were they saying, "Oh, this is for fun, this is recreational, this is for health, this is for spirituality," or were those things more integrated and holistic?
Thank you. And I think after that we'll move on to the panel, but there'll still be opportunity to ask questions.
I'm Antonio Costasso, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. And my question is similar to the previous one, and is about the use of psychedelic treatment perhaps in the future in the NHS. And I was wondering that a lot of patients, for instance, that don't do very well in CBT or similar treatments, also because they're very, very, very crystallized in a way, and they're unable to change. And I was wondering if, for instance, it's conceivable to couple a psychedelic experience with then a sort of more traditional CBT. So you will do maybe in a very specialized center the psychedelic experience that might somehow shift the mind of these people in a way that they will be able to engage with even CBT or other kind of treatment done at even a GP practice or something.
That's how it was used pre-prohibition, within the context of an ongoing psychotherapy relationship and with people who were stuck, psychologically stuck. And the idea is by loosening cognitive frameworks that you introduce a therapeutic window of opportunity. But that also speaks to the possibility of risk as well. And hence why we're focusing on treatment-resistant depression. But it, as a paradigm, could be applied to many different forms of habitual, maladaptive thinking, feeling, behavioural patterns.
And so just very good. And can you also consider that microdosing in this sort of paradigm rather than giving big, psychedelic dose?
We can't do microdosing studies really whilst the drug is in Schedule 1 because you can't get it for people to take away. I mean, if you were to do a microdosing study, someone would have to come to the pharmacy every day and swallow their microdose and then go, and that introduces practical difficulties. I'd love to do those trials, but I think probably we need to get the drug out of Schedule 1 before we do.
I think it might get to the question that was being asked before about the therapeutic relationship, is to be able to have this profound experience under the within the therapeutic relationship. I think can really enhance the relationship. I think it can engender hope in a client who might seem hopeless to have a profound mystical type experience. So it may not be the mystical experience, maybe, wow, something finally really happened with my therapy. And now maybe I'll listen to the other stuff they have to say too. So I think it's both. I think it can engender a sense of self-efficacy, a sense of self-potential. I think all of it. And it certainly doesn't mean that the CBT, the straight up and down, challenging, dysfunctional thoughts, I'm a big proponent of that as well. So might be able to get the buy-in that's some of that hard work of CBT, as you mentioned.
So I think what we're going to do now is, I'd first of all like to thank Zach again, fantastic talk. Really. I'm now going to invite our other panel members to come up. So we have Michelle Baker-Jones. She's an integrative psychotherapeutic counsellor in private practice. She's also a member of the Imperial College Psychedelic Research Team and currently undertaking a randomised controlled trial with psilocybin as well. She also offers individual integration sessions for people who are struggling to process psychedelic experiences, and she also co-facilitates a monthly psychedelic integration group. And then next, I'd like to introduce Ashleigh Murphy. She's also working in the psilocybin for depression trial at Imperial College London. She's trained as a mindfulness meditation teacher and recently completed psychopharmacological research with ayahuasca as part of her MSc. She's also assisted in ceremonies in Peru, leading mindfulness sessions developed to support preparation and integration. And she's also one of the organisers of Breaking Convention. Because neither Michelle or Ashleigh have had any chance to speak yet, I thought we'd give you 5 minutes or so just to give us your thoughts on this topic and maybe how you see things sort of working out in the future with regards to this and the trials that we're doing.
Well, I was kind of thinking about the model thing, and I suppose I was struck by how in Imperial we start off with, being very kind of open and very humanistic and very much, creating this relationship, because we have to create it very quickly. We have to develop that trust very quickly. And we've been, I suppose, developing a model as we go along, and it's sort of loosely based around that, but we're kind of thinking about how you embody the insights, that being a really important part of the experience. But also, I suppose one thing to really bear in mind is that in integration in particular, so we have this idea of the funnel, and that we really don't want to be directive initially. We really want the participant to develop their own narratives, their own meanings. We see this as really crucial to their healing, because we're creating the containment. We very much want them to be empowered by their experience. And I suppose the crucial part for us is, once they've developed their values, created their meanings, is that we encourage them. So what one thing can you do, tomorrow to implement or pay homage to that value? So I completely understand the necessity to have a model as such, but I think what's been lovely is to kind of have a vague model, but to really kind of develop and refine it whilst on a clinical trial. So, thank you.
And I was thinking from my experience at Imperial how the whole team dynamic would play into that. If there's any tension or difficulty that could.
Well, we are a multidisciplinary team, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we are largely a group of women, which is very interesting. And I personally haven't found any, I mean, there are pressures that we're under, but I think we are all very supportive of each other, and we learn as we go along. I mean, so far, I'm sure there will be instances where things get quite fraught and difficult, but so far, it's all been going rather swimmingly.
Yeah, this speaks to the importance of team cohesion, because having worked in the NHS, when you see teams go wrong and the effects that it can have on patients, and then introducing psychedelic into the equation, you've got to be very careful, and that's why I talk about the difficulties of scaling this therapy and how it might be regulated. Actually, can you say a little bit more? I'm quite interested in how one quickly forms trust with people, because that's something that Michelle said, and of course it's something we try to do as well, because unfortunately time is money, and treatments are introduced based on how much they cost. So what are the sort of core components that allow us to form trust quickly?
So I think that actually challenges a little bit our existing kind of therapeutic models within the NHS, because it seems to be really about being real. So to have a kind of a very real humanness with people very quickly. So to be very honest with people and to be really, really there, and this is where I think mindfulness comes in as well, like having presence, being present with ourselves and being present with the participants. And I think it's because in a psychedelic state, really, we're taking people into an altered state of consciousness, which is incredibly delicate, and the feeling, the merging, the kind of boundaries are very different. Yeah, so there's something about meeting people in a different kind of space. The connection is very deep in a way, and I think kind of honouring that with an honesty of self as the therapist kind of helps to build trust quite deeply.
That brings me naturally into this slightly sensitive topic of self-disclosure, which shows a recent Vice article about, which I'm close to the saying it causes me some anxiety to talk about it. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that. And I'm not talking about necessarily personal disclosure of psychedelics, but I have a personal history of depression, and actually you have to pick your moments, but it can be quite an icebreaker if someone knows that you've been there too.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful actually in this therapy. I think it's kind of really case by case, and it's like really feeling the moment and being really sensitive to the moment of what's really happening here, what's really unfolding, and is there an opening, and is it the right thing? And I think we have to like really kind of be checking ourselves and really present with ourselves, like, why would we share this? Is this the right moment? Is it therapeutically significant and helpful? But I've definitely witnessed over the course of the trial so far, there are moments where it creates an opening and it creates a connection, and that connection is deeply healing and therapeutic, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Liam, basically done the legwork of this, of organising this event. For your thoughts on psychedelics, integration, and mindfulness image.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very bit of a surreal happening, because we've been sitting with this logo and with this idea of this event for a few months now, and thinking about it and planning it, and just having those words, mindfulness and integration, constantly in our awareness. And working in integration groups, and there's something about that word, integration, that the more sort of look at it, we think, well, what is this actually trying to say? What people mean when they talk about integration in a psychedelic experience? There's so many different answers to that, but really I was thinking now while we're talking about what would this event look like? It was called on mindfulness and preparation instead of integration. Because there's something about this rapid expansion that we're noticing now, this psychedelic renaissance, and that there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of sort of care, and there's sort of a rush sometimes, because there's this big tidal wave of movement that's happening. And from an individual perspective, it might mean that a person dives into an experience unprepared, or lacking certain sets of safety, or appreciation for these other states of consciousness that might provide and reveal a whole world of experience that is magical and mystical, so potentially frightening. And the more we work around integration, the more thinking about actually preparation. And I wasn't really preparing to talk about this now, but somehow it's here. And I guess I'm wondering what people on this panel think about maybe the difference or the importance or the variation between integrating versus preparation. We had one training session with Bill Richards from Johns Hopkins, and he said to us very, very clearly that 1 hour of preparation is worth 10 hours of integration.
If it's the right preparation.
We spent approximately 2.5 hours on prep, and it has similar, we have a guided visualization in the prep, which is very lengthy and kind of tries, and it's kind of, it's like you're going deep down into your internal world, feeling around what emotions emerge, and then, you're kind of staying with them and trying to, find the gem, the pearl in that pain, and then you kind of come up and you kind of look at it. And so, we're trying to mimic something like the psychedelic experience. And all our prep is, in and through, face the dragons, trust, be open, let go. So it's very much creating that flow state. So we have that as part of our guided visualization as part of the prep. I recently had one participant who said it really, really helped him feel prepared for the experience the next day. And then we have a similar integration kind of tool which will kind of feed back into that guided visualization. So something people can take away and just kind of, that modeling of your pain is, has something worthwhile in it if you're able to go in, especially with depression. There's a gem, there's, a pearl of wisdom in it. So, we spend quite a lot of time with prep and integration, and I suppose, it's something that's kind of just developed through our work. But, yeah, I think they're both equally as important.
It suppose for me, it seems as though there's a sort of core theme that runs through both, which is flexibility and sensitivity.
Yeah, completely.
I thought perhaps we'd open up to questions from people now. So, lady in the pink t-shirt.
Thank you for the event. My question is about the universality of the psychedelic experience. Do you think cultural perception of the self and ego could change the experience itself? Thank you.
I think inevitably. I think what you were asking was the sort of difference between the universal element to the experience and then cultural expressions of self and how that might interact. What a question. It's as complex as culture and our sense of the self itself and the brain. I can't imagine that it wouldn't have pretty profound influences. And I suppose it underpins for me an element of this. I mean, depression is a very heterogeneous thing anyway. I mean, mental health is a hugely diverse subject, and some people are never going to touch psychedelics, and that's fine. It's not for them. And similarly, some people would never want to touch psychedelics in a clinical environment. That's fine. It's not for them. But my experience of the clinical trials is that there are people who, for their own personal, cultural reasons, do want to explore psychedelics in a medically supported context. So the answer to your question is yes, and I'm slightly stymied by my own subjective experience. It's a sort of slightly self-selecting treatment, or self-selecting experience, and that's okay.
I mean, I think we know for certain that set and setting are important, and a big piece of the set is what you're coming in with culturally. And I can only imagine how different it would be to come from a place where it's a cultural expectation that when you come of a certain age, you're going to drink ayahuasca with your parents. I think that would be very different than the experience that we have now. At the same time, I think, and so many of us from the Western tradition want to read up on it all we can. And I just think of an ayahuasquero I work with who said, many of you have really read up on the computer about ayahuasca and you're prepared for ayahuasca. He said, the computer's never taken ayahuasca. So I think we do come in with some preconceptions and I, very difficult to parse, but on some level, perhaps it's breaking down that set. At some level of the mystical experience, getting towards that core humanity, whatever that is, that's beyond those differences. So I think it's both.
And in fact, so much of the prep work is trying to deconstruct the expectations so that the person can be in a kind of more trusting, surrendering state so they can really go with the experience.
Maybe I can add just something about the paradox of what your question presented me with, is because, I think there's something that the psychedelic experience, whatever that it might be, in any culture, in any time, there's those two words, there's this universality and there's the self. And to what extent in our Western culture, in the medical, the scientific models that we work in, maybe there's something about that these experiences really reveal how preoccupied we are with ourselves. And to what extent can we have this more bifocal vision as individuals and as a society to look at adolescence that might be there are to do with cultures, other traditions, and where do we fit in. And this sort of idea of a connectedness to others and relatedness to others, and how does it get translated into the life of the individual, but then also and also societal aspects. And I think it's very fine now to how to balance the universality and also the preoccupation with the self.
Maybe I'll add something to that too, if that's okay. That I think this is one of the reasons why I'm so happy that mindfulness and psychedelics are coming together. Because if from the kind of contemplative traditions we have like Sangha and from Buddhism we have communities. And at the moment we're kind of bringing psychedelics in a clinical model. But what would be amazing to see is group work and to have kind of intentional communities and kind of growing up around this and actually that connection to other, really being embedded in our communities. So yeah, I think mindfulness could possibly help with that.
There's someone at the back, I'm sorry I can't see your face because the banner's in the way, but white t-shirt instead.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier that I think you said it was helpful that you'd shared your history of depression with someone that you're working with or somebody who's on the trial. So I was just wondering, in that vein, how important do you think it is for your trial team to be as diverse as the people participating? In terms of having relatable experiences.
I see. Well, you come up against a logistical problem, don't you? Which is, how do you pay that many people to be part of your team? I think, I suppose, within the trials, the universality is the diagnosis of depression or the feelings of depression. So there's that commonality there. We, within our group here, have a number of people who volunteer their time with us, and we try and select them based on who they are, but we try to reflect as wide a range of sort of demographics as possible, with the hope that we will be able to match people to their underlying experiences. But it's very hard to know until you meet someone how to match them. So I think that then speaks again to the necessity for flexibility and to inculcate that sense of openness and honesty in the dynamic between therapist and participant. If it's not working, then okay, that's fine, we'll change it. So I guess that's the way I approach it, is to go back to that idea of openness and flexibility and approach to the dynamic that's evolving.
Thank you.
The first speaker, there was a lot of statistics in what was discussed, like odds ratios and that sort of stuff. And it seems like a lot of those were correlational measures. They weren't, the implication is that the use of psychedelics may result in less violence. That was what seemed to be the implication of what you're talking about. But it was a correlational, associational measure. So it seems to me that you may be now trying to get some RCTs going. The second, the person next to you, the woman next to you, I don't remember her name, she may be doing an RCT. And an RCT, as opposed to those other statistical measures, would allow you to establish a cause-and-effect relationship and not just an association. Because there could be a third variable affecting both the desire to take a hallucinogenic substance and less recidivism or less violence. So an RCT would allow you to disentangle some of those, issues. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I think we need all designs, though, and I think that a cross-sectional study tells a story, and an RCT tells a story. The cost for entry to telling a story based on an RCT is very high, and we kind of reified the RCT. You always hear the RCT is the gold standard, and certainly it's a very powerful design. But we have several people every day in Vancouver dying of opioid overdoses. And all those medications went through rigorous RCTs. So I think we need a diversity of methodologies And you're right, there can always be third variables. And there's also third variables in terms of who gets into an RCT. So if there's an easy way to enroll several thousand incarcerated men in an RCT, I would really like to do that as well.
Yeah, you might struggle to get it through ethics at the moment. You know, there's so many barriers to doing this sort of work, and it's wrapped up in the stigma and legal status that's associated with the drugs, and also just because they're so expensive to do. Yeah, in the ideal world, we do RCTs with associated mechanism studies with all sorts of different cohorts, but in the real world, we're sort of concentrating on what I would call the low-hanging fruit, which is not a great term really, but it's the way governments think about.
But there will be an RCT done, right?
We are working on RCTs and together with large cross-sectional and cohort studies, I think are particularly powerful at looking at it because it allows us, and that was a cross-sectional study, not a cohort study, but I think cohort studies are an emerging, when we talk about the real world, you know, a cohort study, we can follow at-risk groups over time and see what variables impact, and we can control for a lot more variables than we can control for in an RCT, and we can also have a lot more power. We talk a lot about cost, and you know, it is really an issue when it comes to administering the therapies and validating them as well, but I think we also have to keep in mind the cost of the problem. And I just want to propose that, you know, if we follow a surgical model, surgeries are terribly expensive. And, you know, the preliminary analyses that go before someone does the surgery, when they go for all their assessments and the x-rays and all of that. So we do have places where we spend a whole lot of money treating people for serious illness. So maybe this could be one of them.
I was going to say as well that the trouble with drug trials is that they can distract us from the underlying, much more powerful psychosocial drivers of things like recidivism too. I'm not even sure we need RCTs for that. Maybe we should just be thinking about the underlying social problems that leads to this behaviour as well. Oh, so many people. Oh, sorry. Microphones are a long way to come.
Thank you for tonight. It's a great pleasure having you, and there is a hope in my heart having you today speaking about these things. So my first question is, so I want to do my thoughts about something. So where are we trying to, like this psychedelic renaissance is happening, we are bringing psychedelics through the back door, telling to people that when they are sick, they can take them, or if they have problems, they can use them. What about healthy people that can try them? What about all the things that you are experiencing on psychedelics? They are phenomenal. All the qualities and what you see, how you feel, and all this superhuman, I could say, qualities that you develop, and they remain with you after that. I can say that this is like one of the most interesting things about psychedelics, and I want to ask you, what do you think that are the reasons that indigenous civilizations use psychedelics? And I want you to consider if there are any models that they used originally we can integrate in psychedelic psychotherapy today. Are we reinventing the wheel?
Yes. But I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily.
What are your thoughts about an entertainment psychedelic industry in which we can have different created settings for different people that want to choose maybe to have to teleportate, like a teleportation experience, or for example, I've designed a sort of model that so the subject is listening to music 7 hours in a row on a psychedelic, taking psychedelics, and the subject is being guided by this music, by a specially created playlist, very carefully selected from the first until the last one. So it's 7 hours, 80 songs that the subject is listening, and these songs are specially created, and when he's listening, he has a particular journey that he's guided through this music, through these vibrations, and he's taken from the lowest vibrations to the highest ones, and then he has like a journey. I've experienced myself this technique many times, and I have some results regarding this. Thank you.
So what was the question?
My question is, I first started with the question. It's about what are your particular thoughts about, and could it emerge a psychedelic entertainment industry in which I create the environment, the song, the sounds, and everything for people that would want to experience these things, because we know there are psychedelics that last 6 hours, then maybe 3 hours, and so on. What do you think? Can it emerge?
Well, it just reminds me of the holodeck on Star Trek. I don't know. The experience is really restricted to being doctor and everything health-related settings. Does anyone else have?
I think really we need to get psychedelics rescheduled, and to do that we have to demonstrate therapeutic potential. But I think people are going to festivals, taking the psychedelics. That's already happening.
I think if you want to talk about the enhancement of well-being as opposed to the diminution of ill-being, sort of what you're getting at. I mean, I think this is part of our legacy as humans, is to access these plants that have been used since time immemorial, and I think it's a terrible human rights affront that we're not allowed to do so. Absolutely. And I worked on medical cannabis for years, and we've recently legalized it in Canada. And one analogy I sometimes use is dogs. Dogs can be a nuisance, and perhaps they bite children. Always a concern with drugs. So if someone were to criminalize dogs and we were to try to legalize them, we say, well, certainly the visually impaired need seeing eye dogs. And we might have support animals for people who are depressed. And then eventually, as we grow that and re-normalize it, we might get to a point where we just love dogs. And that's where I'd like to go.
Where's Catherine? Go chat with me.
Hi. You mentioned the mechanisms that might be influencing these things that you're observing, sort of CBT and mindfulness. And my inkling is that so many of our thoughts are kind of negative thought patterns or kind of caused by traumas, and mindfulness kind of ignores all of it and in turn gets rid of what is mostly negative, whereas CBT kind of rearranges what's going on to be more negative, positive. So from a clinical point of view, which one do you think is more effective?
I think we don't know. I think it is an empirical question. Both. I think both, depending on what the individual is looking for and how to conceptualize their difficulties. So, in general, we all have our own pet orientations, and I tend to be more of a behaviorist, and that I'm more inclined to distance from thoughts than to wrangle with them. So I tend towards mindfulness, but I think that at the end of the day, it's sort of a technical debate amongst therapists, perhaps, whether or not identifying the thoughts and changing them is really just a way of distancing from them, whether you can really change a thought, or whether just engaging them as things to be changed ultimately results in a distancing from them, which is the same as going directly to the distancing. I think that's what the third way behaviorists would say, would be that cognitive behavioral therapy operates through these same decentering mechanisms whereby you learn that your thoughts are just thoughts and you can respond to them. perhaps as you like, or at least be less bound to them. So I think they may be similar paths to the same location, and it may depend on the client and on the therapist and on that relationship.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. You've got to finish by 8:30. I'm sorry to those of you who won't get a chance. The chap in the grey t-shirt.
Yeah, thank you to all of you. Really inspiring. I don't have much scientific background, but I've got a bit of psychedelic background, and one of the things I've noticed from starting to do meditation is that the nausea from psychedelics seemed to completely dissipate and disappear, and I wondered why that might be the case from my experience.
The nausea.
So from 6 months of meditation practice, regular daily practice, the nausea from the psychedelics had gone. And I wondered what that means for you.
Well, maybe the meditation gives you the chance to engage with that sort of bodily aspect of yourself. I don't know. That would be my theory. You're giving yourself the space to engage with a bodily sensation that perhaps you would otherwise sort of arise as part of your trip because it was not being attended to.
The transition, I imagine, into the fact of meditating, I imagine helps you transition into a psychedelic experience in an easier way. So you're kind of, it's like a form of preparation, I suppose. So you have that tool now, so you can use that to transition into that experience in a way that is probably easier.
It's a very interesting question and ties into what Michelle was talking about, the guided visualization and centering and meditating. But I'll go back to this practice of the full awareness of breathing, and it's 16 meditations that were sort of instructed by the Buddha. And the first one is the one that we did here together, which is the awareness of the breath. And it gradually goes towards the body. So about the third and fourth you are becoming aware of the body and centering the body. And it goes on and continues until 14, 15, 16. And at the ladder of meditations, you get to those places of impermanence. You get to those places of no breath and no death. You get to those more sort of mystical places. So when you were talking, I was thinking that maybe ties into this idea of our preparations. You really have to go through these stages. You have to go through this breath, and through this body, and through this mind, and through these feelings, and get to those other realms that they are around the corner or behind a very thin veil. That was my thoughts.
One more question.
Hi,
I'm not sure that's on. It's got some little red button.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say thank you for the lovely presentation and also creating a lovely space of I like to say like-minded individuals. Also, the fact that you're very experienced in your relationship skills in regards to psychedelics and assisted psychotherapy, I suppose I wanted to ask two questions. One, I suppose, how would you advise somebody who, perhaps like me, who's in training for clinical psychology or relationship fields, how do you advise them to go about how to advocate for these kind of research in particular? So I'm interested quite a lot in this literature based in psychotherapy, but I don't know, how do you go about proclaiming that? I suppose what's the significance of disclosure is I'm going about that during in practice in professional spaces, I suppose.
So there are two questions. One of them.
So how would you advise somebody who's in training, so not particularly as expertise?
Okay, right, yeah.
How to go about advocating that, and what would you say the significance of disclosure is when they're going about advocating for these things in professional spaces?
I didn't catch the second part of your question, sorry.
Asking third part, I'm so sorry. The significance of disclosure when you're in professional spaces or academic institutions, so to speak.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, so when I was a trainee and we were doing the Imperial Pilot study, I published an article in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, and it resulted in an awful lot of media attention for me, and it was exceedingly anxiety provoking because as a trainee, I thought that you're more vulnerable. But my experience actually was that there was, really the article was only questioning the legal status of the drugs and how that affects research. So it was quite reasonable, and actually even the Daily Mail wrote a positive piece about it. And the only negative piece I got actually was from a psychedelic evangelist who said, how dare you say that they should be in Schedule 2? They should be liberalised. So there's this idea of how do you stick your head above the parapet. And my answer to that is to be reasonable, accept others' points of view, and stick to the evidence. Because I don't think anyone can accuse you of being unreasonable for doing that. But I think we all have to accept, and here it's kind of preaching to the converted, isn't it? But actually the major work is talking to people who do not believe and do for their own reasons are very much set against this sort of thing. But again, I think it comes down to an acceptance of their point of view and the inculcation of a dynamic in which you can accept each other's point of view. Perhaps that creates the space for change. Perhaps not. But we're not trying to change the world here. Just introduce something slightly different.
I'd say stay curious. Don't be certain. As was pointed out earlier, we don't have the trials. We can't say this works. Here's the dose. So just be curious, much like that, and then communicate that curiosity.
And if it's something you're really interested in pursuing, then to connect to other people. So shameless plug for Breaking Convention. Like-minded people, find the others. Have a support around of people that you can actually go through with and practice kind of how to communicate it more widely.
Yeah, I was thinking about the state of not knowing, and that being okay. We don't know whether psychedelics work. I describe my position when the media asks me as hopeful agnosticism. So I'm not sure, and that's good science. I've got a theory that it might help. I'm collecting the evidence, and I'm ready for it to be wrong. And I think if you can adopt that position, that allows you then to accept the point of view of others, and maybe it allows them, if they are very fixed in their view, to wonder whether they might be wrong too. So I guess that's the way I think about it sort of thing, and that's the way I'd suggest going about it. So, on that sense of not knowing, we shall end. I want to thank all our speakers: Ashleigh, Michelle, Zach, Liam for organising, Tim, Catherine, Luke, Simon, who've all contributed towards the organisation of this event. It's been fantastic. I have some gifts, or we have some gifts for our speakers that we'll present to them now. But can you join me in giving them fantastic rounds? extend by saying that we will be organising other events like this, so keep an eye out on our social media pages and email lists. And I hope to see you all again here very soon. Thank you very much.